at the Liverpool, England docks in 1903. This is what she, obviously, the kind of activity she saw. And after that, you'll see what it was like getting off the boat on Ellis Island in New York. So that's what she did. She went to Liverpool, as I said earlier, and then got off in New York. And this is the sounds and the sights of those two places. Nobody had suitcases in those days. They were all trunks. Everything was put in trunks. And now we're at Ellis Island. This isn't a group coming from Norway, I don't think. This looks more Eastern European, but anyway, it's what it was the right year, so I thought I'd show you what the arrival of immigrants looked like. They're all tired, I'm sure, after all that. Took at least a week to get there. All right, so she landed in April of 1903 by boat. She had already made all the land transportation plans. She knew she had the forward transportation to Chicago by train, of course. And then on from there to Minneapolis. She did change her reservations going into Minneapolis, though, because she was absolutely exhausted, and she stayed in Chicago for a few nights at a hotel with Bertha and Rasmus, her brother Rasmus, because she said she didn't want to show up in Minneapolis where her husband-to-be would see her, you know, totally exhausted. She wanted to be a little awake when she met him again, because they hadn't seen each other now for 3 or 4 years. It's a long time to be away. So that's her husband, the picture that he had sent her in 1901 from Minneapolis. And this other picture is a picture of Minneapolis, a building that no longer exists. Again, I was telling Bill earlier, that's the exposition building that had been built in the 1880s. And in 1892, Minneapolis, unbelievably, was named as the location for the Republican National Convention. Minneapolis wasn't very well known, but they had built some beautiful hotels there. And the reason they had built all these hotels is in the summer, people from the South would come up with their slaves up in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and stay in these hotels. And so they were very nice hotels. And that's why Minneapolis was kind of growing as a vacation spot for Southerners at that time. So, yeah, they started a home in northeast Minneapolis. This is just a couple of them. They had 9 houses. They'd move almost either every year, every other year. As the family grew, for some reason, they decided to change houses. And he made a very wise decision. I should say they made a very wise decision. Instead of just selling the house, they'd rent them out and keep them. And so that was how they were able to sustain themselves through the Depression. Their rental income, they were very particular who they rented to. And as a fact of the matter is they only rented typically to General Mills employees. Grandpa Thorson, Rasmus Thorson, Carrie's husband, was the chief millwright at General Mills. He was very well liked. The president of the company, James Ford Bell, knew him by first name basis. Many of the executives of the company would have Grandpa take his tool chest of picks and awls and hammers and all these kinds of things and come up to their houses. He was a great finishing carpenter. He loved to make scrolls and flowers and things around doorways and windowsills, and they'd have him come over, and he got a little extra money on that too. So they sustained themselves quite well during the hard times of the Depression. During the 1910s, they had two children. One actually passed, though, so there were three that she had, but the first, Elma, passed away just a couple of months after birth. Then the second child was also Elma. She was born in 1906, and that's my mother, Elma Thorson. And then her sister Thelma was born in 1908. There were three more children to be born: Bertha, Theodore. No, excuse me, two others: Theodore and Richard. Theodore, two boys. Again, in the 1910s, this is my mother, second from the left there, in her Sunday school class, and the young lady, third from the right, was Alice Iverson. She came over just a year before this picture was taken. Didn't really speak any English at all, and she and mother were friends until they were both in their 90s, absolutely as close as you can be, and they'd see each other often. And I grew up with Alice, knowing her very, very well. That's just the way it worked for the family. If you met someone and you loved them, they didn't leave you. Of course, mother never left Minneapolis either. She did for vacations, but that was another. My wife and my son and I, we have three in the family. Craig is now married and gone, of course, but we were just the opposite. Being in the military for 30 years, we moved every few years. So we didn't have that blessing of maintaining that. The other picture is a picture of her sister Anna and her husband and children. Anna was the step sister, and she died of breast cancer in her late 30s. Very, very beautiful girl, and so there was a lot of death that she lived through. I think maybe you heard that Grandma Thorson lived. The only one who survived of her children was my mother, Elma. She was still alive when Grandma Thorson passed. So she had, Carrie survived the death of all her children except one. The 20s for the family, as I said, for most people, the late 20s were a terrible time with the economy. The early 20s, of course, was a great time. They call it the Roaring 20s. And the Thorsons were doing well with their homes and their rentals, and his job was very secure. General Mills was not called General Mills yet. It was called Washburn Crosby. And that was another mill that they eventually bought several other mills and became General Mills. But it was very, very lucrative business to be in. And this is my mother's confirmation picture. All in Norwegian, all the services were Norwegian, well into the late 30s, early 40s. Reverend Austin was like a god. They just loved him. He just an amazing man. And mother's confirmation class was all in Norwegian, of course. And they had a piano in the house. Almost everyone did. That was the only real source of entertainment in those days. And interestingly enough, my nephew, my sister's son, is a piano tuner now. So it's the piano business is alive and well in the family. But 1920 class, confirmation class. Grandma, my mother did not go to finish high school. She went instead to work at Donaldson's department store, a competitor to Dayton's. Dayton's being the store that was the parent company of the Target stores. But she was worked in notions, selling laces and threads and all those kinds of things. My mother and her brother Richard, this boy in the middle, that's my mother in the center, and her brother Richard, they were the two kids in the family that just couldn't be controlled very well. The book is quite open because Grandma was open about it. She said, "I want you to write the book the way it was." Richard was basically an alcoholic, unfortunately, all his life, even starting in the 20s. He was a rum runner during Prohibition era, and just he was a good guy when he was sober, but I think I saw him sober once. But very, very, very nice man otherwise, but got a little loud when he was drunk. Mother was married very, very early in her life and had my sister with another husband. It wasn't my father, but my sister, the stepsister, was born in 1928, and mother was divorced just a few months after Lois was. Sorry about that. IRS keeps calling constantly. Yeah, Lois was born, and the fellow left. The husband left right away, and then mother didn't get married again until 1941. So she was a single lady again from 1928 to 1941, and then that was my father, and then I didn't come along until 46. So it was a long time. But mother was kind of an interesting character, very, very forward. She was a Rosie the Riveter type during the war, made 50 caliber machine gun bullets at the Arsenal plant in Minneapolis. And she got fired. Believe me, it's hard to believe you get fired from the Arsenal, but it was a safety violation. She was talking to the lady next to her, and the boss heard it, and she said, "You're done." So off she went. Then she started going making false teeth at the Boost Dental Laboratory. Not a lot of similarity between the two jobs, I guess. But, that was mother. She loved to work outside the house. But when I came along in 46, that ended. Of course, the war was over, and dentures weren't even as popular back those days. So anyway, and the other picture there, it's just a picture that Grandma Thorson was so proud of. One of her cousins took a picture of the family when he went back to Norway again in the 20s. A real early picture. The picture is just hilarious. I love I'd forgotten that many men grew beards below their chin. The guy near the front. I thought that was a fairly typical style of beard. We don't see that anymore, but that was typical of Norwegians to have that, I guess.
Oh, I see.
Their 9th house in Minneapolis was this one, and this is their final home, built in 1928. They built it because Lois, my sister, was going to be born, and they wanted a house that was a little bit bigger again. So they built a back porch and a front porch on this house. It wasn't built yet, but this was their final home on McKinley Street in Northeast Minneapolis. Because my mother was working, like I said, Grandma Thorson ended up being a mother, really, of my sister. Mother was gone a lot, and when she wasn't working, she liked to have friends, and she'd go fishing with them. I'm not saying mother wasn't a good mother, but she liked to have her fun, and so Grandma Thorson ended up really raising Lois. This is a picture of next to it of my mother Elma and her daughter Lois, my sister. Lois, I don't think really knew her mother in this picture. She looked a little upset being in her lap there. But every family has its stories. I say the chapter on the 30s was called Work, Joy, Pain, and I can't read it because all the pictures are there, but I can't remember the name. But anyway, it's a picture again of the family. Grandma's older brother, Olaf, moved to Chicago, and they would go and visit him occasionally. So that's Grandma Thorson there in that one picture, and her brother Olaf above her right shoulder, and his children, and then my grandma's son Ted and his wife Elliot. That's my father there sitting like a Prince of Araby or something. It looks like an ice cream man. But that was I think 1935. He was had a barber shop in Dinkytown in Minneapolis near the University of Minnesota. And so this was soon after he had met my mother, and they were married again in 1941. So that's Lois, my sister, half sister, on the sitting the larger of the two girls, and Ted and Elliot's daughter between my dad's legs there. And the other picture, of course, is Richard, again, mother's brother, who was the alcoholic, and wouldn't you know it, he was working as a delivery man for Glick's Brewery. Yeah, didn't stay far from the bottle, even at work. So we loved him, but it was a challenge. All right, the 40s, a tough time for everybody. They were so concerned about Norway during the war. As you, I'm sure, know, Norway was invaded. They were occupied by the Germans. The Germans put in their own prime minister, Quisling, and Grandpa Thorson were very, very concerned about relatives and friends and how they were going to survive. And they had originally wanted to go to Norway in 1940, but the war broke out, of course, and 41 we entered the war, end of the year, and so that was put off. They were going to go in 46, but then their son Ted got cancer, and so that didn't work out. He had not passed when they did finally leave in 1948. They weren't going to go, but he insisted they go. He said, you've got to go now. So he was still alive when they came back 2 months later, but he didn't live much longer after that. But anyway, the trip was absolutely marvelous for them. They were happy to see that the war had not really changed much back in Northfjord anyway. So when they left for Minneapolis, they had about 40 people come to the airport to see them off. That was typical. And can you imagine going on a plane ride dressed like that? I wonder if they asked her to take her hat off when she sat down. You couldn't see over her head probably if you didn't. But yeah, he was dressed with the full regalia there, vest and everything. That was a little different world that we're in. And I don't know if you can see it, but the next picture over there, that's Grandma sitting at the foot of the glacier. It's called the Jostedal Glacier, and she was so proud of that fact. The stream that ran off that would fed into Lake Lowen was the most beautiful aquamarine. The minerals in that glacier fed that lake. I've never seen a more beautiful lake than that. So they stayed in Norway for 2 months, and that's their passport picture. That I used that picture there of her on the front of the book, but that was taken just before they left for Norway. And then, of course, the other picture, I've listed all the relatives that she saw from one side of the family. The old man on the front row to the left holding the little boy in his lap is my grandfather Rasmus's brother. There were just the two of them in the family. Rasmus was the younger of the two, and so he had no right of inheritance to any of the property there in Northfjord. So that's why Rasmus, one of the reasons he left. And the brother Anders did stay on the farm. He owned it and was quite successful there. He had a lot of acreage. And so that was that. And my wife and I and son had been to Norway now and seen the family there. I've been there a few times. And they're very welcoming, very, very welcoming family. Most of the people in this photo now, of course, have passed, but we had a wonderful time when we went.